Jake, Sarah, and Mark had been planning their camping trip for weeks. They wanted to escape the city and spend a weekend disconnected from the chaos of modern life. The chosen campsite was deep in the woods, near a lake that Jake remembered visiting as a child. The group arrived in the late afternoon. The sunlight filtered through the dense trees, painting the forest floor in golden hues. They set up their tents and gathered firewood, joking and laughing as the scent of pine filled the crisp air. But as they worked, Jake noticed the strange quietness of the forest. No birds sang, no insects buzzed. It was unnaturally silent, like the forest was holding its breath. That night, the trio sat around the campfire, sharing ghost stories and roasting marshmallows. The fire crackled, casting dancing shadows on the trees. As the conversation died down, Sarah got up to collect more firewood. She wandered only a short distance from the campsite when she felt it, an overwhelming sense of being watched. Turning slowly, she scanned the darkness. At first she saw nothing, but then her eyes adjusted. Among the trees, faintly glowing eyes stared back at her. She dropped the firewood and ran back to the others, her breath hitching. "Something's out there," she whispered, trembling. Jake and Mark grabbed flashlights and peered into the forest. The beams cut through the darkness, revealing only trees. But then Jake saw them. Multiple pairs of eyes, glowing faintly. They were spaced too far apart to belong to a single animal. And they didn't blink. Despite Sarah's protests, the group decided to stay. "It's probably just deer," Mark reasoned, though his voice wavered. They stoked the fire higher, as if its warmth and light could protect them. As the hours passed, the forest remained silent. But just as they began to relax, the whispers started. At first it was faint, like the rustle of leaves. Then it grew louder, a cacophony of unintelligible murmurs. The sound came from all around them, as if the forest itself was alive. Jake stood, his flashlight shaking in his hand. "Who's there?" he shouted. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the group into an oppressive silence. The group eventually fell into an uneasy sleep. At dawn, Sarah woke first and stepped out of her tent. She froze. Around the campsite were footprints, large, human-like but distorted with elongated toes. "Guys, wake up!" she yelled, her voice tinged with panic. Jake and Mark stumbled out of their tents and stared at the tracks. They formed a circle around the camp as if something had been watching them all night. Mark knelt to examine the prints. "These aren't normal. They're too big, and they don't look human." The group decided to pack up and leave immediately. But as they prepared to go, Sarah noticed something horrifying. Her backpack, which she had left zipped inside her tent, was now sitting at the edge of the tree line. They set off down the trail, determined to reach their car before anything else could happen. Mark nodded, his hand tightening around the camping knife he had brought. The trail, which had been clear and well marked on their way in, now seemed to twist and split in ways they didn't recognize. It was as if the forest was trying to confuse them. As they pressed on, Mark suddenly screamed. Turning, Jake and Sarah saw him on the ground, clawing at his ankle. His pant leg was torn and deep bloody scratches marred his skin. "It grabbed me!" he yelled, panic in his eyes. "What grabbed you?" Jake shouted, pulling Mark to his feet. "I don't know. It came out of the ground," Mark stammered, limping as they resumed their frantic pace. They moved faster now, adrenaline coursing through their veins. But the forest seemed endless, the path twisting back on itself. The whispers grew louder, almost deafening, as if the forest was mocking them. Mark, struggling to keep up, suddenly stopped. "What are you doing?" Sarah yelled, grabbing his arm. But Mark's eyes were wide and unfocused, fixed on something in the distance. Before Jake and Sarah could react, Mark bolted into the trees. "Mark, wait!" Jake shouted, chasing after him. But the forest swallowed Mark whole. Jake and Sarah searched desperately, but there was no trace of him. No footprints, no broken branches. It was as if he had vanished into thin air. Desperate and terrified, Jake and Sarah abandoned the search for Mark and made a mad dash for the parking area. The trail finally opened up to the dirt lot where their car was parked. They threw their gear into the trunk and scrambled inside. Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling, as Sarah kept glancing back at the tree line. The engine roared to life, and as they screamed away, Sarah screamed. Jake looked in the rearview mirror and saw them. Shadowy figures standing at the edge of the forest, their glowing eyes fixed on the retreating car. Jake and Sarah reported Mark's disappearance to the authorities. A search party combed the woods for days, but no trace of him was ever found. The officers dismissed their story of glowing eyes and whispers, chalking it up to stress and exhaustion. Months later, Jake couldn't shake the feeling that the forest hadn't let them go entirely. He began having vivid nightmares of the glowing eyes and the whispers. Sometimes he swore he could hear faint murmurs outside his apartment window. Sarah moved to a different city, unable to bear the memories of that night. But even she admitted that she felt watched, as if the forest's shadow had followed her. Years later, hikers in the area began reporting strange occurrences, disembodied whispers, sightings of glowing eyes, and even the occasional disappearance. The locals refused to enter the forest after dark, calling it cursed. To this day, Jake wonders what really happened in those woods. He knows one thing for certain: the forest is alive, and it doesn't let everyone leave. Claire moved into the apartment on a chilly autumn afternoon. She had been thrilled to find a place so affordable and close to her work. The building was old but charming, with creaky wooden floors and large windows that let in plenty of light. The landlord, an elderly man with a crooked smile, mentioned something odd before handing over the keys. "Let me know if anything seems off," he said, almost as if it were an afterthought. Claire dismissed it as a quirk of his age. Her first few nights in the apartment were uneventful, but something felt off. The silence was heavier than she expected, like the walls were absorbing sound. Occasionally, she thought she heard faint footsteps above her, though the landlord had assured her the unit above was unoccupied. It began with small things. Claire would find her belongings in places she didn't remember leaving them. Her keys on the kitchen counter instead of the hook. Her favorite coffee mug moved from the cabinet to the sink. She chalked it up to being forgetful. Then, one night while working late on her computer, she saw movement in her peripheral vision. She turned quickly, but nothing was there. Her heart pounded as she scanned the room. Everything was where it should be, yet the air felt heavier. Her eyes darted to the corner near her closet. For a moment, she could have sworn she saw a dark outline. The following week, the incidents escalated. Claire began waking up in the middle of the night, feeling as though someone was in the room with her. One night, she woke to the sensation of cold air brushing her face. Her window was shut, yet she could feel the faintest breath against her cheek. Her fear turned to dread when she noticed her closet door was slightly open. Claire always closed it before bed. Trembling, she turned on the lamp. The room was empty, but her eyes were drawn to the shadows pooling in the open closet. She swore she saw something shift before slamming the door shut and retreating to her bed. For ages in the Shadowland, Claire's breaking point came a few nights later. She had set up her phone to record while she slept, hoping to capture proof that something was amiss. Reviewing the footage the next morning, her stomach dropped. At 3:14 a.m., the phone captured faint movement near the foot of her bed. A shadowy figure emerged from the corner, its form indistinct, but unmistakably human. It didn't move like a person. It glided, silent and deliberate. For several minutes, the figure stood at her bedside, motionless. Then it leaned forward, as if whispering into her ear. Claire froze, unable to comprehend what she was seeing. She rewound the footage, hoping she had imagined it. But the figure was still there. That night, Claire resolved to stay awake. She armed herself with a flashlight and a kitchen knife, determined to confront whatever was haunting her. At around 2:30 a.m., she heard it. A faint, raspy whisper. It wasn't coming from outside. It was in her room. Her breath hitched as she scanned the room with her flashlight. The beam landed on her closet, and her blood ran cold. The door was open again, though she was sure she had locked it. Then she saw it. The figure stepped out of the closet, its form darker than the surrounding shadows. It didn't have a face, but Claire could feel its gaze piercing through her. The whispering grew louder, incomprehensible, but maddeningly insistent. Claire didn't wait to see what would happen next. She bolted from the room, grabbing her keys and phone as she fled the apartment. She spent the night in her car, too terrified to return. The next morning, she called the landlord and demanded answers. At first, he was evasive, but under pressure, he admitted that the previous tenant had abruptly left, citing strange occurrences. Claire hung up and never returned to the apartment, leaving her belongings behind. Months later, Claire tried to move on, but the experience stayed with her. She began to research the apartment's history, uncovering a chilling pattern. Tenants rarely stayed longer than a year. Some claimed to hear whispers, others reported seeing figures. No one could explain it, but one thing was clear. Whatever lurked in that apartment wasn't bound by the laws of the living. To this day, Claire avoids dark corners and always sleeps with the lights on. She knows what she saw, and she knows one thing for certain: it wasn't human.